The glow from my laptop screen was the only light in the dining room, a pale blue pool cutting through the heavy pre-dawn darkness. My fingers moved quickly over the keyboard, each tap a thread weaving together 18 months of research into the final chapter of my graduate thesis. Outside, the February cold pressed against the windows, but inside, my veins ran hot with adrenaline and bitter coffee. Less than 4 hours remained before the noon deadline. Every sentence I typed was another step toward a life I had fought for since the day I first dared to dream of leaving this house behind. I had been awake for 30 hours, my eyes burning, but I was almost free. The silence broke with the slow, deliberate creak of the hallway floorboards. Samantha's silhouette appeared in the doorway, framed in shadow. My sister had a talent for arriving when I least wanted her around, and today her presence wrapped around me like smoke before a fire. She leaned against the frame arms, crossed the corner of her mouth curling. "Still pretending you're important," she said, voice dripping with scorn. I kept my eyes on the screen, willing my hands to stay steady. "Just a few more hours," I said evenly. "I'm almost finished." She stepped forward, circling the table like a cat watching prey. Her gaze fell on my carefully stacked notes, and her fingers grazed the top page, the scratch of her nails against the paper setting my teeth on edge. She asked why I was wasting my time on something that would never matter, why I didn't get a real job like a normal person. I forced my voice to remain calm, told her this was my final thesis due today and that I needed to focus. Her eyes narrowed with the same look she'd worn since we were kids, the look that meant she had already decided how this would end. She reached for my laptop. I moved to block her, my arm brushing against hers, the heat of her skin sharp and invasive. "Don't touch it," I said. Something shifted in her expression, mocking amusement sliding into cold intent. She wrenched the laptop from the table with a sudden jerk, her knuckles whitening around the edge. For a frozen half-second, I thought she might hold it hostage, make me beg. Then she moved. The arc of her arms cut through the air, and the hard corner of the laptop crashed into the side of my skull. The crack was deafening, a sound I felt in my teeth and deep in my bones. White light exploded in my vision, and the room tilted violently. Warmth blossomed along my temple and began to run down my cheek. My knees gave way, the floor rushing up to meet me. The laptop hit the ground, splitting open the screen, dangling by a wire. She stood above me, her breathing quick, her eyes glinting with a satisfaction that turned my stomach. "You're a leech," she said, her voice low and certain. "You don't deserve a future." The words landed heavier than the blow, lodging deep in a place she'd been aiming for all along. My pulse thundered in my ears, drowning out the faint hum of the refrigerator. I pressed my palm to my head and felt the slick heat of blood. The air smelled of coffee and metal. In the corner of the room, my thesis, every word, every sleepless night, was trapped inside the broken shell on the floor. Samantha straightened, brushing an imaginary speck from her sleeve, and walked toward the kitchen. A cupboard door creaked open, the casual clink of a mug followed. My hands shook as I stared at the wreckage. The sting in my skull was sharp, but sharper still was the realization that she had chosen this exact moment, the moment my future balanced on a knife's edge to shatter it. And in that moment, even through the pain, I knew this was not just about the laptop. This was about making sure I never escaped. I grew up in a town so small it didn't need a name on a map, the kind of place where the water tower doubled as both a landmark and a clock, its peeling paint marking the passage of years better than any calendar. Our house sat at the far end of a gravel road, a squat two-story, with siding the color of cigarette ash and a front porch that leaned slightly like it was tired of holding itself up. Inside those walls was the Thompson family, though we were less a family and more a collection of people tied together by blood and habit. My father Richard was a man who measured worth in calluses and hours on the clock, his hands permanently rough from decades at the machine shop, his voice carrying the weight of someone who believed hard labor was the only honest work. My mother, Elaine, had once been warm, at least that's what old photos suggested, but by the time I was old enough to notice, she had long since learned that keeping the peace meant agreeing with Richard no matter what he said. She managed the household with a quiet efficiency, cleaning, cooking, and making herself small in the spaces between his opinions. And then there was Samantha, my older sister by 4 years and my earliest rival. Where I was quiet and bookish, she was loud and confident with the kind of beauty that made people excuse her sharper edges. She'd been the golden child since the day she was born, praised for her quick wit and social charm, never mind that her grades hovered somewhere between passable and barely passing. By the time I was in middle school, Samantha was already skipping classes without consequence, working part-time at a local boutique, and bragging about how she didn't need fancy schooling to make her way in the world. In our parents' eyes, that was independence. In mine, it was a get-out-of-jail-free card she played every chance she got. My own path was different. I had discovered early on that books were my way out, that the pages of a library card could take me farther than the cracked sidewalks of our neighborhood ever would. I spent my afternoons at the town library working through novels, science experiments, and history texts while Samantha hung out with friends at the diner or rode around in her boyfriend's pickup truck. When I won the elementary school spelling bee, the principal shook my hand and beamed like I was bound for great things. At home, my parents barely looked up from the television when I told them. Samantha smirked and asked if knowing how to spell anti-disestablishmentarianism could get me a real job. By the time I reached high school, the pattern was set. Samantha was the center of attention at family gatherings, her stories about work drama and new boyfriends earning nods of approval. I was the afterthought, the one they remembered to ask about only when there was a lull in conversation. If I mentioned an academic award, Dad would grunt something about how it wouldn't matter in the real world, and Mom would change the subject to what Samantha had been up to lately. The gap between us grew with every year, not just in how we lived, but in how we were seen. She was the daughter they understood, practical, familiar, rooted. I was the one they couldn't quite place, the one whose ambitions felt like an insult to the life they had chosen. That divide was the foundation of everything that came later. It was why Samantha knew exactly where to hit me when she wanted to hurt me most. It wasn't just about sibling rivalry. It was about the unspoken rule in our house: you could dream, but not too big. Not so big, it made the rest of them feel small. And I had been breaking that rule for as long as I could remember. From the time I could form sentences, I understood that in our house, admiration was a currency I would never earn. Samantha didn't need to work for it. She could drop out of things halfway and still be called determined. She could forget birthdays and still be praised as thoughtful. Meanwhile, I could study until my eyes burned and still be told I was wasting my time. The earliest memory I have of the imbalance was in 3rd grade when my teacher, Mrs. Clayton, sent home a note saying I was reading at a high school level. I clutched that note like a medal all the way home, only to have Dad barely glance at it before muttering that books wouldn't fix a flat tire or put food on the table. Samantha, sitting at the counter painting her nails, laughed and asked if my fancy reading meant I could figure out how to make her a snack. In 5th grade, I entered the regional science fair with a project on plant growth under different light conditions. It was the first time I had stayed after school every day for weeks using the lab with my teacher's supervision. I won 2nd place, a silver ribbon, and a $20 gift card to a bookstore, and for a moment, I thought maybe this would matter at home. But when I walked in holding the ribbon, Dad didn't look up from his paper. Mom said that's nice, the same way she might respond to someone saying it might rain tomorrow. Samantha rolled her eyes and asked if the plants I studied were at least edible. In middle school, the gap became a chasm. I joined the debate club, the academic decathlon team, and student council. My days were crammed with meetings and competitions. Samantha had dropped most of her extracurriculars, claiming they were a waste of time. Yet every time she landed a new part-time job or showed off a pair of expensive shoes she'd bought, our parents lit up with pride. They said she was independent, making her own money, preparing for real life. I was told I was avoiding the real world by hiding in classrooms. The final break in any illusion of fairness came junior year of high school when I was nominated for a state-level academic award. It was the kind of honor that could open doors for scholarships, the kind of thing guidance counselors dream of putting on a student's college applications. The award ceremony was 3 hours away, scheduled for a Saturday morning. When I told my parents, Dad shook his head and said gas wasn't free. Mom suggested I take the bus. Samantha had a hair appointment that afternoon, and when I asked if she could skip it so they could come with me, she laughed and said, "Priorities, little sister." So I went alone, accepted my award from a state senator, and sat by myself while other kids posed for photos with their families. I kept the certificate in perfect condition, framed it, and hung it above my desk, but I never saw anyone in my family even glance at it. These moments stacked on top of each other like bricks building a wall between me and them. I learned to keep my achievements quiet to savor them in private. I also learned that Samantha viewed every step I took toward my goals as a personal challenge. If I stayed up late studying, she would blast music outside my door. If I needed the computer for research, she would suddenly decide she needed it for online shopping. And through it all, my parents either ignored it or defended her. They called it normal sibling teasing, told me to toughen up, accused me of overreacting. But it was more than teasing. It was a deliberate campaign to keep me from stepping outside the role they had assigned me, the one where I stayed in Samantha's shadow. That was the root of the conflict, not one fight or one insult, but years of being told in every way possible that wanting more than what they had chosen for themselves was an act of betrayal. By the time I reached high school, the list of times my family had made me feel invisible could have filled a notebook. Freshman year, I qualified for the state science competition with a water filtration project that my chemistry teacher said could win. The competition was held 2 hours away on a Saturday morning. I asked if they would drive me and sit in the audience. Dad said he had to work overtime. Mom said she needed to help Samantha shop for a dress for an upcoming wedding. I went with my teacher instead, and when I placed first in my category and got a small scholarship check, I came home to an empty kitchen. The check stayed tucked in my desk drawer for weeks before I used it for textbooks. Sophomore year, I made it to the finals of the Regional Spelling Bee, an event held in the auditorium at our own school. The place was packed with parents and siblings waving signs and snapping photos. I scanned the crowd from the stage, but there was no one I recognized. Afterward, while other kids celebrated with their families, I walked home alone carrying my finalist certificate, which later got bent when Samantha shoved it off the counter to make space for her shopping bags. Junior year brought what I thought would be a turning point. I was selected to give a speech at the end-of-year academic awards night. It was a big deal attended by local officials and covered by the small-town newspaper. I wore my best dress borrowed from a neighbor and practiced for weeks. When the night came, Dad said it was pointless to listen to a bunch of kids talk about books and stayed home. Mom claimed she had a migraine. Samantha said she had better things to do. I stood on that stage, looked out at the sea of strangers, and delivered my speech to polite applause. Afterward, the principal told me my parents would have been proud. I smiled, but inside, I knew they wouldn't have been. Even my small personal victories at home were short-lived. Once I saved up for months from tutoring jobs to buy a second-hand laptop so I could work without fighting over the family computer. The day it arrived, Samantha borrowed it without asking, spilled soda on the keyboard, and returned it with the keys sticking and the touchpad barely working. When I told Mom, she said I shouldn't have left it unattended, as if the fault was mine. Another time, I won a writing contest that came with a cash prize. I used it to buy myself a winter coat to replace the one that no longer fit. Samantha made a point of borrowing it the first cold day, spilling coffee on the sleeve, and then leaving it in the trunk of her car for a week so the stain set. These weren't accidents. They were reminders. Every time I tried to create something of my own, she found a way to take it, ruin it, or make me regret it. My parents' response was always the same: minimize excuse and protect her. They would say I was making a big deal out of nothing, or that Samantha hadn't meant any harm. But harm was exactly the point. It was death by 1,000 cuts, a steady drip of disrespect designed to make me question the value of my own achievements. Over time, I stopped expecting them to show up to care or to protect me. I learned to guard my ambitions like secrets, to work in the library until closing, to hide my projects under my bed. Yet even with all my caution, there was always the looming shadow of the next time they would remind me where I stood in the family hierarchy beneath Samantha, no matter what I did. By the start of senior year, I knew there was only one way forward, and it wasn't here. I had spent too many years watching Samantha coast through life with the full support of our parents, while every step I took toward something better was met with indifference or outright sabotage. I realized that if I wanted a future on my terms, I would have to build it without them, brick by brick, in secret if necessary. I started staying later at school under the pretense of helping teachers clean classrooms so I could use the library computers to research scholarships and college applications. We didn't have internet at home unless Samantha needed it for shopping or streaming shows, so every form I filled out was done in stolen hours between the end of classes and the time the janitor locked the building. I created a new email address that none of my family knew about and asked my English teacher, Mrs. Lopez, if I could list her as my contact on applications so acceptance letters wouldn't be intercepted. She didn't ask for the full story, but I think she already knew because she gave me a nod and said, "Of course." I applied to every scholarship I could find, from national competitions to obscure local awards for students interested in environmental science or literature. I pored over essay prompts late into the night, writing drafts in my notebook by the dim light of my desk lamp, then typing them up at school the next day. I kept my files hidden in a folder labeled Biology Notes in case Samantha decided to snoop on a borrowed flash drive. Each acceptance or semi-finalist email felt like a small victory, a piece of proof that the life I wanted was possible. I didn't tell a soul at home. The idea of them knowing of having them dismiss or destroy my chances before they even took root was too much to risk. When the first major scholarship came through, a full tuition offer from a state university 2 hours away, I printed the letter in the school office and folded it carefully into an envelope I tucked under the loose floorboard beneath my bed. I would take it out at night, run my fingers over the embossed university crest, and imagine what it would feel like to walk across a campus where no one knew me as Samantha's little sister. By spring, I had pieced together enough scholarships and grants to cover tuition, room, and board. I waited until 2 weeks before graduation to tell them, thinking, maybe, just maybe, the news would spark some pride. When I finally worked up the courage, the reaction was a silent room, followed by Dad slamming his fork down on his plate and saying, "So you think you're too good for us now?" Samantha smirked over her glass of iced tea and said, "Real life doesn't happen in classrooms." Mom stared at the table and said nothing. That night, lying in bed, I decided I would never again seek their approval. It was a turning point I didn't announce, but I carried it with me. When I boarded the Greyhound bus that August with one suitcase and my second-hand laptop, I felt both terrified and weightless. I didn't know if I could survive entirely on my own, but I knew staying would be worse. I made myself a promise as the bus pulled onto the highway, no matter how hard it got, no matter how close I came to failing, I would not quit and I would not come crawling back. That vow became my anchor through every long night and every moment of doubt. It was the quiet fuel that kept me going when there was no one else to lean on, the invisible thread pulling me toward the life I was determined to claim. The first semester at university was a shock to the system, not because of the classes, but because of everything outside them. I arrived on campus with one suitcase of clothes, a backpack full of notebooks, and a battered laptop that wheezed every time it started up. The scholarship covered tuition, housing, and a meal plan, but it didn't leave room for anything extra. My dorm room was small, shared with a girl named Marissa, whose parents had filled her side with new furniture, a mini fridge stocked with snacks, and a closet full of brand-name clothes. She was nice enough, but every time her mom dropped by with a bag of groceries, or her dad fixed something for her, I felt the sharp reminder of what I didn't have. I got a job in the campus coffee shop within my first month, working mornings before class. The pay was barely enough to cover toiletries, laundry, and the occasional textbook that wasn't included in the scholarship, but it was something. When shifts opened up at a diner 3 blocks from campus, I took them too, filling my evenings with waiting tables until close and then walking back to the dorm in the quiet cold. It didn't take long for exhaustion to set in. My days started at 5 a.m. and often didn't end until after midnight when I finally finished my readings and problem sets. I survived on free coffee from the shop and leftover fries from the diner. I wore the same 3 pairs of jeans on rotation and mended holes in my sweaters rather than replace them. At first, I thought I could keep the pace forever, but in October, I came down with strep throat. The clinic visit and antibiotics cost more than I had in savings, so I had to choose between paying the bill immediately or covering the utility fee for my dorm. I paid for the medicine, knowing the lights and internet in my room would be cut until the fee was paid. For a week, I shuffled between the library and the dining hall, using public Wi-Fi to keep up with assignments. I didn't tell anyone at home. I knew the response would be either laughter or some comment about learning responsibility the hard way. Thanksgiving came, and most students left campus to be with their families. I signed up for extra shifts at both jobs, earning double pay at the diner. The empty campus was eerie, but the quiet meant I could catch up on assignments. By December, I had moved into a small, off-campus room above a garage, paying less than the dorm rate, but losing the convenience of campus facilities. The walls were thin, the heater unreliable, and the bathroom shared with 2 other renters, but it was mine. Each month was a delicate balancing act, one unexpected expense away from collapse. There were nights I cried from sheer exhaustion, my hands shaking as I typed the last lines of an essay due at midnight, but I never thought about quitting. Every hardship was proof that I could keep moving forward without them. The absence of their voices, their constant put-downs, was almost a relief. I could fail on my own terms now, and that freedom, even when it hurt, was worth everything. By the end of my first year, I had learned to survive on little sleep, a tighter budget than I thought possible, and the quiet determination that I would never give them the satisfaction of seeing me give up. By the start of my second year, something began to shift. The relentless grind of classes and 2 jobs had become a rhythm I could keep, and my grades didn't just hold steady, they climbed. I found myself on the dean's list for the first time, my name printed on a sheet of paper tacked to a bulletin board outside the registrar's office. I stood there staring at it one afternoon, coffee cup in hand, letting the weight of it sink in. Nobody at home would care, but I did. I took a picture anyway and saved it to my phone as a reminder that progress was possible, even without applause. That same semester, my advisor, Dr. Peterson, pulled me aside after a seminar and said he'd been impressed with my research paper on community water systems. He asked if I'd consider applying for a competitive undergraduate research grant. The idea of someone not only noticing my work but believing it was worth funding left me speechless. I filled out the application with the same obsessive care I had for my scholarships, revising every sentence until it felt bulletproof. Weeks later, when I got the email saying I'd been awarded the grant, I sat in the library staring at the screen, barely able to breathe. The funding covered my project expenses and came with a modest stipend, which meant I could cut back one of my diner shifts. For the first time since leaving home, I had a little breathing room in my budget. That fall, I presented my preliminary findings at the university's research symposium. I stood behind the podium in a borrowed blazer, my hands trembling at first, but as I spoke, I saw faces in the audience leaning forward, nodding, scribbling notes. They were listening, really listening. When the session ended, 2 professors I'd never met approached me to say my work had real potential. Walking back to my apartment that night, I realized I was starting to build something tangible, a reputation, a future, an identity separate from the version of me my family had always defined. By junior year, the research grant had turned into an invitation to join Dr. Peterson's lab as an assistant. The pay was better than the diner and the hours fit around my classes. I traded my apron for lab gloves, my order pad for a notebook filled with data. The work was demanding but exhilarating. I started to imagine graduate school, maybe even publishing my research. It felt dangerous to dream that far ahead, like tempting fate, but the thought refused to leave me. I didn't tell my family about any of it. Experience had taught me that sharing good news with them only invited sarcasm or sabotage. Instead, I confided in a few close friends who celebrated with me over pizza and late-night study sessions. There were still hard days, weeks, when deadlines piled up and my bank balance hovered near zero, but the hope was real now. It sat in my chest like a steady flame lighting the way forward. I knew that as long as I kept moving, kept building, there was a life ahead of me that no one could take away. The distance from where I had started to where I was now felt enormous, and yet I also knew this was only the beginning. Every success, no matter how small, was proof that I was right to leave and that I could become someone beyond the narrow role I'd been assigned at home. What I didn't realize then was that all of this progress, all of this fragile hope would soon be tested in ways I had never imagined, and the person leading that test would be the one who had been undermining me since childhood. By the time my final year of graduate school began, my savings had worn thin again. The stipend from my teaching assistantship covered tuition and basic living expenses, but when my car broke down in the middle of the semester, the cost of repairs blew a hole straight through my budget. Without a reliable way to get to campus, my options narrowed quickly. I hated the idea, but the cheapest short-term solution was moving back home for a few weeks until I could regroup. I told myself it would just be temporary, that I could keep my head down, avoid conflict, and focus on finishing my thesis. When I walked back into the house, the smells and sounds were the same as I remembered: coffee brewing in the morning, the hum of the old refrigerator, the muted thump of footsteps on the upstairs landing, but the undercurrent of tension was immediate. Samantha greeted me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and a comment about how she thought I'd finally realized living in the real world wasn't so easy. Mom fussed over me just enough to make it seem like she was glad I was there, while Dad stayed mostly silent, observing from his spot in the living room like a judge waiting to deliver a verdict. At first, I stuck to my plan. I set up a small workspace in my old bedroom, now half-storage closet, and left for campus early in the morning. I returned late at night, avoiding long conversations. But it didn't take long for Samantha to start testing the boundaries. She'd turn the TV up loud just as I was settling in to revise a chapter. She'd borrow my pens or scatter my papers across the dining table, claiming she needed the space for something else. Once I came home to find she had moved my laptop to the edge of the counter, the charger dangling, the whole setup one bump away from crashing to the floor. I didn't need to ask if it was deliberate. I'd known her games long enough to recognize the patterns. My parents didn't say anything, though. I knew they noticed. If anything, they seemed amused, as if these disruptions were proof I wasn't as serious or disciplined as I thought. The closer I got to my submission deadline, the more obvious the interference became. Samantha would call me into the kitchen for family talks that turned into her recounting some trivial work drama while I watched the clock tick away precious minutes. She would invite friends over and laugh loudly in the next room while I tried to transcribe interview notes. When I asked her to keep it down one night, she looked me straight in the eye and said maybe if I'd chosen a real job like hers, I wouldn't need to spend so many nights chained to a computer. Mom began chiming in with little comments about how stressed I looked, suggesting I take a break and help with chores or go out with Samantha to unwind. I recognized it for what it was: pressure to step away from my work right when I needed to be most focused. The air in the house felt charged, like a storm was building just beyond the horizon. Every interaction carried an edge, an unspoken challenge. Samantha, who had been indifferent to my academic life for years, now seemed fixated on it, as though my thesis was a direct threat to her position in the family. I could feel my patience thinning, my guard slipping. Still, I kept telling myself that if I could just hold on a little longer, if I could get to the day I submitted my thesis without letting her derail me, I would be free for good. What I didn't realize was that she was waiting for that exact moment to make her move, the moment when I would be most invested, most vulnerable, and least able to absorb the hit she had been planning since the day I walked back through the door. The night before my thesis defense, I had triple-checked every file, every backup, every note. My laptop was my lifeline, the single vessel holding 3 years of research drafts, citations, and late-night epiphanies. I had printed a hard copy as a safeguard, but the defense committee required the digital version for the presentation, and I had refined my slides until every transition was perfect. That evening, I stayed in my room with the door closed, headphones on, running through the slides aloud, my nerves buzzing. Around midnight, I stepped out to grab a glass of water. Samantha was leaning against the kitchen counter, scrolling through her phone, smirking in a way that set my skin crawling. "Big day tomorrow," she said, her voice syrupy and mocking. I ignored her and filled my glass. She followed me back toward my room, tossing out little jabs about how I was overconfident, how maybe the professors would finally see through me. I kept my eyes forward, telling myself not to take the bait. I had almost reached my door when she called out, "Hey, Leech, you forgot something." I turned confused, just in time to see her step into my room and grab my laptop from the desk. My heart slammed into my ribs. "Put it down," I said, my voice shaking. She tilted her head, feigning thought, then said, "You don't deserve this future you think you're building." And before I could move, she swung the laptop up and brought it down on my head. The crack of impact was deafening in my ears, a blinding flash tearing through my skull as I stumbled back against the wall. The laptop clattered to the floor, the screen spiderwebbed with fractures. For a moment, everything went muffled except for the rush of blood in my ears. My hands shook as I reached for the device, but she kicked it away, sending it skidding under the bed. "Oops," she said, her grin, wide eyes gleaming with satisfaction. Pain radiated from the side of my head, but the sharper ache came from the realization of what she'd just taken from me. Not just the machine, but the culmination of years of work. I lunged for it, pulling it out, cradling it in my lap like a wounded animal. The screen was black now, unresponsive. "You're insane," I hissed, but she only laughed and sauntered toward the door. "Better learn your place," she said. I dragged myself to my desk, plugging in the charger, trying every shortcut I knew, but the laptop stayed dead. Panic rose in my throat. My backup was on an external drive, but when I reached for it, the drawer was empty. I spun around and she was holding it up in her hand like a prize. "Looking for this?" she asked before tossing it into her open tote bag. My voice cracked as I told her to give it back, but she just shrugged and said, "Maybe after tomorrow." I was shaking so hard I could barely form words. Mom appeared in the hallway, then frowning as though I were the one making a scene. "What's going on?" she asked. I stammered out the truth, pointing at the laptop, the bag. Samantha cut in smoothly, claiming I had been yelling at her for no reason, that I'd probably dropped the laptop myself. Mom's eyes narrowed at me, not her. "You always blame her for your own mistakes," she said. My chest tightened. I realized then that there would be no help from them, no justice here, not tonight. Samantha smirked over Mom's shoulder, her gaze saying clearly, "I win." But she didn't see the flicker of something else ignite in me, something colder than rage and sharper than fear, a clarity that this was the moment to stop surviving quietly and start planning the kind of payback that would leave a mark she could never laugh off. I barely slept that night, lying in the dark with a pounding head and the hollow weight of loss pressing on my chest. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her smirk, heard the snap of my laptop hitting my skull, felt the helplessness of my mother's indifference. By 5 a.m., I stopped pretending to rest. I sat up, clutching a notepad, and began listing everything I still had: my printed copy of the thesis, a cloud backup of an earlier draft on the university server, a few saved emails with attachments, and most importantly, a handful of professors who knew my work intimately. My pulse steadied as I realized that while Samantha had taken the latest version, she hadn't erased my knowledge or my connections. I showered, dressed in my most professional outfit, and left without breakfast, ignoring the muffled taunts she threw from her room as I passed. The campus was quiet when I arrived, sunlight slanting across the old brick buildings. My advisor, Dr. Ellis, was already in his office, a mug of coffee in hand. He looked up in surprise when I walked in, hair still damp, eyes ringed with exhaustion. "What happened to you?" he asked. I told him everything, not the watered-down version, but the full truth, the violence, the theft, the years of control. His brow furrowed deeper with every word. "Do you still have any version of the thesis?" he asked when I finished. I slid the printed copy across his desk. "It's missing some edits, but I can work from it." He scanned a few pages, then nodded sharply. "We'll make it work." For the next 5 hours, I sat in the department's computer lab, retyping sections, patching in saved paragraphs from my email drafts, and rebuilding my slides from scratch. The rhythm of the work pushed the chaos of last night to the edges of my mind. Each keystroke felt like an act of defiance, a refusal to let her take more than she already had. At noon, Dr. Ellis checked in. "You're pulling this off," he said, his tone a mix of surprise and admiration. "After the defense, you need to report what happened. This isn't just sibling rivalry, it's assault and academic sabotage." His words lit a fuse in me. I had always been afraid that speaking up would make things worse, that my parents would close ranks around Samantha, that I'd be painted as the problem. But now, with the swelling on my temple and the ache in my neck as evidence, I saw the truth. Silence had never protected me. It had only emboldened them. By the time my defense began at 3 p.m., I was running on caffeine and adrenaline, my slides clean and cohesive, my voice steady as I presented. The committee asked hard questions, but I met each one head-on, drawing on every late night, every painstaking revision. When it was over, they stepped out to deliberate, leaving me alone with the thud of my heartbeat in my ears. 10 minutes later, they returned. Dr. Ellis smiled as he announced unanimous pass. Relief flooded me, sharp and dizzying. But beneath it was something else, a steel thread of resolve. This victory wasn't just academic, it was proof that Samantha's worst blow hadn't broken me. As I walked out of the building into the crisp evening air, I wasn't thinking about celebrating. I was thinking about the flash drive Dr. Ellis had given me with my final thesis saved securely, the photos I'd taken of my injury that morning, and the emails I'd already queued to the university's disciplinary board and the police. Samantha had wanted to end my future. Instead, she had handed me the perfect opportunity to expose her and the family that had always protected her to a world that would finally see the truth. The real defense was only just beginning, and this time, I wasn't defending my thesis. I was defending my life. The morning after my successful defense, I stood in the small conference room of the university's disciplinary board, my injury photos projected on a large screen beside me. The dean, a stern woman with sharp eyes, sat at the head of the table, flanked by Dr. Ellis, the campus security chief, and two faculty members from the ethics committee. They had already read my emailed statement, but seeing the images, the swollen purple welt across my temple, the faint outline of the laptop's edge made the air in the room tighten. "Tell us exactly what happened," the dean said, her voice measured. I recounted the events in meticulous detail, starting from Samantha's intrusion into my room to the moment I collapsed on the floor, dizzy and clutching my head, and ending with the destruction of my laptop. I didn't sanitize it. I didn't minimize it. When I finished, Dr. Ellis handed over a printed timeline he'd helped me prepare, corroborated by timestamps from my emails, witness statements from two classmates I'd called for help that night, and the repair report from my previous university laptop that Samantha had damaged months earlier. The security chief leaned forward. "Do you have any idea why your sister would do this?" I met his gaze. Because I was about to achieve something she couldn't control. My thesis was my own, not something she could take credit for, and because she knew our parents would never hold her accountable. There was a murmur around the table. The dean tapped her pen thoughtfully. "And you're willing to make a formal police report?" "Already filed," I said. That got their attention. A few hours later, I was in a different room this time at the local police station, sitting across from an officer who was reviewing my statement. He had the injury photos, the flash drive containing security camera footage from the night before, captured by a neighbor's doorbell camera as Samantha stormed into my apartment building, and my advisor's written testimony. "We'll bring her in for questioning," he said. "And if what you've told us checks out, she's looking at charges for assault and destruction of property." By evening, the story had already reached parts of the campus. A classmate posted on the student forum about my defense, mentioning that I'd done it under extreme circumstances. Others chimed in with their own observations, and soon people were asking why Samantha, known to many through my social media, was suddenly avoiding campus. I didn't have to push the story. It spread on its own. The following week, the university issued a formal statement. Any student found guilty of intentionally sabotaging another's academic work, especially through violence, would face immediate expulsion. Though they didn't name her, everyone knew. The real blow came when the local news picked up the story after the police report became public record. The headline was brutal. "Graduate student completes thesis defense after violent attack. Suspect is her own sister." My parents called that night, their voices sharp with anger. Not at Samantha for being arrested, but at me for airing family matters in public. "You've humiliated us," my mother hissed. "Do you realize how this looks?" "Yes," I said calmly. "It looks like the truth." There was silence on the line before my father muttered, "You'll regret this." But the thing was, I didn't. For the first time, their threats sounded small. I hung up before they could say more. By the end of the month, Samantha was formally charged. She withdrew from the university rather than face expulsion, and word got out that several of her friends had cut ties with her. The family's reputation in our hometown shifted. Whispers replaced the praise they were used to. People finally saw the cracks in the image they'd spent years cultivating. And me, I walked across the stage at graduation with a healed temple, my thesis bound and in my hands, and a smile that told anyone watching I had survived the worst they could throw at me. I didn't just reclaim my future, I made sure the world knew exactly who had tried to steal it. Graduation day arrived with clear skies and a steady breeze that lifted the edges of my gown as I stood in line with my classmates. The crowd in the auditorium buzzed with excitement, flashes from cameras lighting up the air like brief bursts of electricity. My name was called, and as I walked across the stage, the applause felt heavier, fuller than I expected. My advisor was at the podium, her eyes warm as she handed me the diploma. She whispered, "You earned this twice over." That quiet acknowledgement was more valuable than any public praise. I looked out into the audience and saw the empty seats where my family might have been. They hadn't shown up, not my parents, not Samantha, not even an obligatory cousin sent to keep up appearances. For a moment, I thought it might sting, but the truth was, the absence felt like fresh air. It was a relief to stand there without pretending for them. After the ceremony, I joined my friends for photographs. My advisor insisted on taking one with me, holding both my diploma and a framed copy of the commendation letter the department had given me for academic excellence under extraordinary adversity. It was a quiet nod to what had happened and to the fact that I'd faced it head on. In the weeks after graduation, the case against Samantha moved slowly through the courts. The police had been thorough and the evidence was irrefutable, but the legal process was deliberate. She took a plea deal admitting to misdemeanor assault and destruction of property avoiding jail, but agreeing to a year of probation and mandated anger management classes. It wasn't the harshest sentence, but it was an official mark on her record, one she couldn't erase or talk her way out of. My parents were livid not at her, but at me. They called once more, their voices tight with resentment. "You've ruined your sister's future," my father said. "No," I replied evenly. "She did that herself." That was the last conversation we had. I stopped answering their calls, blocked their numbers, and allowed silence to settle where their constant noise used to be. My new life began in a small but bright apartment across the city. I decorated it with plants and books, filling the space with things I chose for myself. My first job offer came from a research firm impressed by my resilience during the thesis ordeal. My advisor had recommended me personally. When I signed the contract, I realized that Samantha's attempt to destroy me had in some strange way highlighted my determination to others. Months later, I heard from a mutual acquaintance that Samantha was struggling to find steady work. The combination of her withdrawal from university and the public nature of the case had left her with fewer opportunities than she'd imagined. My parents' social circle had grown smaller too. Fewer invitations, more polite smiles that didn't reach the eyes. Actions have consequences, and they were finally living in the reality they'd always shielded themselves from. I didn't celebrate their downfall, but I didn't pity them either. My focus was forward. One evening, I was invited to speak at a campus event about overcoming academic challenges. Standing at the podium, I looked at the audience, students, professors, and a few parents, and shared my story not as gossip, but as a reminder. People will try to define your worth based on their limitations. Don't let them. Your future is yours to claim. The applause was long, but what mattered most was seeing the faces of a few students in the front row who seemed to be holding on to those words like they were lifelines. That night, as I walked home under the city lights, I thought about the moment Samantha's laptop blow connected with my head and the words she'd spat Leech, "You don't deserve a future." I smiled to myself. I had one anyway, and it was bigger, brighter, and more mine than she could have ever imagined. The past was behind me, the consequences had landed where they belonged, and the life ahead was entirely my own.